Hello everyone, today we talk about Rome during the years of the Fascist Empire. It was proclaimed after the Italian conquest of Ethiopia in 1936 until, at least we stop there, the beginning of World War II. This is the first time we talked about Fascist Italy. This video is actually dedicated to Rome. It's part of the Urbs history playlist that is dedicated specifically to the city of Rome, which is not actually including other videos on, say, for example, the Roman Empire or, let's say, the histories of Rome that, however, are not pertaining to the history of the city per se. But it's obvious, also considering the scale of the topics treated here. So we're looking at essentially the Pact of Steel, the racial laws, and more. Like, of course, we'll have to extend, right, the Ethiopian War, the Spanish War, and so on. We have to really to extend a bit the horizon, because, as you know, I've been toying actually from quite some time with the idea of talking more about contemporary history, not just warfare. We will be doing the latter, especially more than ever before. In the near future, I already began something about the Freikorps, for example, recently, aside from, say, Overlord that we covered just for, memorial, good memorial reasons. And these topics are much more important than one normally thinks. I'm first of all aware to be talking in front of largely an American audience. And I, as you know, cover mostly European history, Western European history, and whenever, say, one looks at the more recent history, and especially such politically loaded one, for what, of course, this still means today, in part because the sad aspect is actually people are forgetting, but they're forgetting badly, not just, passing from one type of historical awareness to another. It's just like passing from historical literacy to historical illiteracy, and the former has never been particularly high already in the first place. In fact, the historical quid, right? The accuracy of it and the relevance of the single topics is very often subordinated, especially on YouTube, to some kind of weird, twisted form of entertainment, and or it's also kind of strange how, like, most history is told to us in structuralistic ways, but when it gets down to World War II, fascists, Nazis, communists, etc., it's mostly just like an evidential history being told there, and skipping the entire background, which actually opens to a very important question. It is the one of how, of course, this is being heard in these terms. How could certain European countries that, after all, had this great history, great past, different levels of advancement when we look at them, but overall, like, fitting, say, the Western European level of development and, say, also aspirations and ambitions in a broader sense as peoples, as countries, as nations, decided to become, say, fascists, Nazis, etc. And of course, fascist Italy is one of the most poignant cases due to not just the fact that Italy invented fascism properly meant, which, however, remained very ideologically flexible in its theory. Like, it's that's why we should talk really more about this. Like, this video is a bit a chance not to address everything, but to start talking about certain things, but also how, of course, these countries had. This is true for Nazi Germany. It's true for every one throughout even the darkest hours in their histories. Actually, pretty important things going on when we talk about, I don't know, physics, archaeology, maths, engineering. That when you look especially at countries like Italy, Germany, etc., you know that there was something particularly advanced going on that, in a sense, has been, it would rightly pass on in the background compared to what eventually happened with the Second World War and the faults, the failures. Mostly these were the Nazi fascist regimes were essentially looking in victory, like in war, like the supreme test of their own legitimacy, right? Not just in a political sense, but in a metaphysical one at the end of the day. And so, as I often say, whenever one looks at military history as a polemologist, the actually most important, most fascinating, most useful, more sort of thought-provoking side of the story after the war is over is actually looking at these countries, the defeated ones, right? And realizing how this had happened and how they reacted to it and how they sort of rose again. Because the interesting aspect about Western Europe, and thankfully, in this sense that if you look at, and this is not true just for Europe, like if you look at Germany, Italy, and Japan randomly for also reasons that have not to do with the Axis, where you look at the single most, the longest living populations in the world. And that's insane to think about this also incredibly brutal and violent past, their defeats. Of course, every one of these countries had a different thing going on. Telling the truth, Italy was the country that had it the easiest in the first place, in spite of the severe defeat and losses, etc. But there is something about these countries' proximity culturally to ourselves that, of course, deserves to be looked at and very carefully and not dismissed just to say, I don't know, this country, like especially in the case, this is the case of Italy, it's a bit like, I don't know, France, right? Why was, you see this YouTube videos, why was France so useless during World War II, or why Italy was, I don't know, what do you want to, why did they betray Germany? Actually, if you look at how things really went, the Germans and Italians heavily distrusted each other since the beginning. There were plenty of things the Nazis did wrong to Italy during the same alliance that actually couldn't mask the fact that in the 30s, Italy and Germany had been actually concurrent with one another until the armistice, until Mussolini was in power. For example, Churchill was notoriously trying to bring him from the Western Allied side, and there is an enormous level, in my opinion, of confusion, or at least lack of, let's say, of interest for these countries as systems on their own and how and why they did so. I've honestly never found on the entire YouTube a single video that would, for example, in this case, tell like Italian history in a just like say at least academically aware sense, like meaning that knowing that there is so much that these things are admittedly maybe even in the same Italy not studied as much as you would think that a country, especially considering the importance of say fascism, World War II, etc. would do. But that doesn't even start to even go pick the actual books that are written on it in whichever language and starting to speak from at least a position of let's make this history not some sort of vague meme of more or less what the average person thinks that, I don't know, like that word was about, which in some sense is not about, I don't know, rehabilitating fascist dictatorships or anything like that, but because there were actually some things that, very, say, even worse things that these regimes did that nobody talks about, and there are some things that instead they're sort of mocked for when actually they also had some, first of all, they were coming from with that in that way for some historical reasons that get often ignored, but also that weren't sometimes even that dreadful disaster that it's usually believed. There is no doubt that fascist Italy as such was a dreadful disaster. But as we were saying before, there were also lots of interesting and even, say, remarkable things going on within it, which I wouldn't say we will surely talk about things like, I don't know, that there were actual Mussolini's super weapons or things that you can call like that, or, other stuff that we can talk from a military point of view. But that, as you know, as Clausewitzians, we approach mostly from a political point of view. And I would think that the most interesting thing about fascism, Italian fascism in this case, is how before World War II, this was, in a sense, ambiguously, but also positively received. For example, across the sea, even in countries like Britain, the United States would end up, in fact, conquering the same Italy during World War II, and that up to a few years before would not seem, or had also, because of deliberate choices of the fascist regime, eventually make them go in another direction. And we will surely be told. I can't find at the moment, because in the cycle I haven't inserted anything in terms of strictly contemporary history, except warfare. So we'll look surely at contemporary Italian warfare somewhat soon. Now I don't know if we have to prepare for this stuff, but let's say there would be a lot of the strictly, say, Italian politics that really deserves being told, and how Italians reacted, like they supported fascism and ended themselves up in World War II, which was not an obvious thing, was not, it was just a process that is very often at least overlooked, and that instead I find extremely interesting. So, as we know, today we talk about the fascist empire that was proclaimed by Mussolini in 1936 after the conquest of Ethiopia was accomplished, because there was properly there an empire of Ethiopia that was at this point ruled by the Italian king Victor Emmanuel III, who became emperor of Ethiopia. But that was part of a broader, say, aggressive posture that the fascist regime had always owned, emerging also after what was called the mutilated victory of World War I, because Italy contributed significantly, to say at least. That's also a very overlooked aspect. Like the Italian front during World War I, it was objectively secondary, but not secondary in the sense that it's one of those things you can't avoid knowing during World War I, that where the Italians had suffered, several 100,000 casualties, but getting actually a very few, mostly because of and that's Versailles, and that's the very complicated and in part poorly controllable situation was forming at the time, with a balance in the Balkans that, as you know, historically were one of major, directions of expansion of unified Italy for obvious reasons, just like today's Italian economy is projected towards those countries, and other grievances with other historically potentially competitive and conflictual powers. That the same so-called Italian side switching during World War I, which was actually stemming from, like, everybody knew in practice that would have happened, that at least that alliance, that was a defensive one, by the way, was completely worthless at that point in history. It had started with essentially the French-Italian rivalry in Tunisia, that historically was a very close counter to Italy, so a very accessible one, that was essentially taken away by the French. And so fascism, say Italy at this point, posed itself with this growing imperial ambitions that fueled that sort of nationalistic, populistic, say, frame that the regime had given to Italian mindset, cultivating, of course, those that fire that sort of burned under the ashes of that terrible war, with a series of claims towards a set of territories. And we're talking Malta, Corsica, Nice, Savoy, and Tunisia. Now each and everyone has some connection. Malta, of course, was geographically speaking, say, within the Italian sphere. There is no doubt about this. It had historically always a massive strategic relevance. It had historically been about the Maltese Knights. There had never been like an Italian, a direct, say, statal national connection to Italy, but it was obviously something that, also, as you know, during World War II was in conquest, an objective of Italy. Corsica, that had historically been bought by the French from the Republic of Genoa, and that seemed just like something at hand, like Sardinia had essentially become part of the of Italy since the beginning, at least because this, as you know, Savoy at the beginning of the 18th century had been given first Sicily. Actually, that's also an overlooked thing, and then they switched it with the Austrians for Sardinia. Hence, the Kingdom of Sardinia, that was a thing from the time of King Heinz, like Frederick II, like in the 13th century. That by feudal supersedence at the time, of course, the Holy Roman Empire at the time, actually, yes, it did exist, but also later the title of kingdom remained, right? And unlike, for example, the one of Italy, that's fascinating. So that Piedmont fundamentally came to be like the Kingdom of Sardinia as such, which connects it also with Nice and Savoy, that, as you know, had been handed over to the French during the wars of the Italian Risorgimento, for essentially having the French army freeing northern Italy from the Habsburgic control. And something absurd in history, like you have an actual ruling house that is the one of Savoy. It is also one of the most ancient and noble in Europe, that actually gives its own ancestral lands of Savoy, that admittedly is from the other sides, from the French side of the Alps, to France, together with Nice, that also was, like I said, a Ligurian Italian city, and that the French get. Tunisia, again, had been always like a small country, easy and like conquerable by the Italians, that, as you know, at the beginning of the 20th century had conquered Libya, in part as a reaction to that, also contributing because of the sort of bouncing phenomena to the breakout of World War I, because that triggered some Balkan wars that eventually destabilized further the region with a weakened Ottoman Empire. And so these claims were fueled by fascist propaganda, which exhibited a tone of contempt towards Western powers, particularly what were called the plutocratic democracies, like we're talking France, the UK, and the United States, right? These were sort of considered as weak democracies, which is also kind of interesting because, at least, again, the other two would, of course, the French would fight in Italy during World War II, for that matter, and also initially in 1940, as you know, repelling the Italian invasion from the Alps, that is strategically nonsensical in many ways. But at that point, Mussolini did it just to, as he voiced it, like having a couple of thousands of deaths just to sit on, the table of peace. And there was, of course, like a broader, say, political division. Like after World War I, essentially a part of Europe had become fascist. There were, like we called, of course, fascism after the Italian one, because this was essentially like the first, like most important country that essentially became fascist in a truly, let's say, governmental sense. We can't say properly institutional one, because actually Mussolini was just like the head of the Italian government, but of the Italian parliament, but not the one of. He wasn't the king. He wasn't. He was actually supported largely like by the monarchy, the industry, and the armed forces when these gave away their support. In fact, fascism auto dissolved. Like they seated at a table and said fascism is over by themselves, right? And that's also like Mussolini was arrested, as you know, by the king, etc. So that's also something that doesn't quite look like. It was actually a totalitarian regime by that point, but not like the typical totalitarian regime that you would say, well, simply, these guys controlled everything, right? Anna Arendt wrote something claiming that she had a lot of contempt for the Italian fascism, and the way it comes out is actually what is considered today like a wrong political analysis. That she claimed that Italy was not a totalitarianism. It actually was, right? It's just that it really worked in a very, in fact, sort of not so complex, but also not so banal way, right? There had been the threat of communism. We talked about it. We talked about the Polish Bolshevik War. We were talking about it with the Soviet Revolution that had broken out in Germany. We talked about it for the Freikorps that basically put that down. So actually, this anti-communism, and read mostly in a nationalistic and, however, statalistic and partially socialistic sense, is notorious. Mussolini at heart always remained a socialist, and a pretty red one. He was notoriously anti-bourgeois, etc. But of course, he had to adapt to the situation, and fascism went through three distinct phases with sort of different contents, let's say, in the authoritarian, dictatorial, and totalitarian phases. This is nobody's opinion. This is the ABC of contemporary European history. And I know that people debate regarding the fact that, no, it's not true that these were socialists because, look, they were different for some reason. As you also know that I personally actually see obviously a socialistic, statalistic matrix behind it. These were ideologies that would not exist until 100 years before, and were properly emerging in what was, especially for those time standards, not just anti-regime and anti-regime and anti-traditional fashion, but of course in a leftistic, mass terroristic ideology. And again, by the time of fascism, the political compass of Europe had rearranged itself, in fact, in a much more liberal sense than it had been in the previous ones, in the previous centuries during the Ancien regime. But this is just because history does not begin in the 20th century, so you cannot make weird analysis by denying that objectively these regimes had very specific socialistic meaning and ideology. Of course, socialistic means different things in color mostly, but not in structure, in fundamentals, right? There is a true reason if the Nazis were called themselves nationalist socialist, and it could have not been possible for them not to have called themselves like that. And this is something that precedes the same Nazis. It's how the same Bismarck made its pact with the Catholics to establish a welfare state, to cope with a mass society that had socialistic in that welfare thing. Actually, to an American audience, that welfare thing would sound very much socialistic, so I don't need to explain it to you. I don't need to specify further. But this is also another story. We're not talking about this today. Now, this Italian policy was driven by a desire for prestige and power, naturally. And it's actually not fair to say that Italy wasn't, at this point, a power among powers. It really was, right? Doesn't matter how, say, underperforming it would be during World War II. Italy was like a major European power, and even though these ambitions far exceeded the actual Italian, the Italian actual capabilities from a technical military standpoint, it doesn't mean that actually Italy did not have political and strategical resources for expanding her power further. Right now, whether how well say thought out these objectives were and how the state would be capable of handling them once achieved is another story, right? But we do not have to confuse the levels, right, of analysis, or just because you see after World War II there were lots of things going on in the West that were absolutely understandable given the situation of the Cold War, etc. But the Italians, for example, wouldn't have a Nuremberg trial, right? And the message was passed in a sense is that the Italians, after all, were some sort of incompetent charlatans that had failed badly, but they weren't so bad actually, because of course in the US there was a lot of Italian American vote to say in that sense electorally, and the sort of Buffonesque idea of Italy that we have somehow maintained the wake of that were many others, like for example the highly honorable Japanese warriors, or the chivalric honorable Germans were just fighting for their own land. Those were completely made up. Just if you like after the war, like before, like people hated these people in so many different ways. For once today, nobody seems to be aware. Like actually, there is a revisitation of appreciation for those very sort of positive stereotypes to rehabilitate Nazi fascism that truly does not understand, in fact, how insidious the Axis actually was, and how even in their failures they actually presented real problems. This has been, to the Allies, this has been pointed out in the sort of most updated historiography of World War II, that the entire Italian war effort in its substance has been significantly downplayed or sort of put aside, and objectively there is a particular hierarchy that does not even depend on this post-World War II thing, but rather on some sort of sense of cultural precedence for some reason. Like some countries are more important to be heard of because they fit more like the aestheticistic or whatever attraction of towards them for whichever political cultural reasons, and then the entire historical reality gets altered on this basis. No, right? You cannot consider yourself as adultly literate person if you ignore French or Italian politics of the 20th century, for example. It's just you can't. Right, you cannot not know it. I'm extremely disturbed objectively by the lack of today's awareness towards 20th century European politics. It seems to me utterly just unbelievable. I don't even have words, in fact, how to express my perplexion towards a word that literally does not know the history of its most important elements. It seems very, very disturbing, to say the least, and explaining a lot of things, also politically. So there was a lot of propaganda, of course, in fascist Italy, and Mussolini and his regime were actually very good and creative at this. There was, for example, and we'll talk about it, cinema, Italian cinema during fascism was actually pretty respectable thing. The propaganda works were extremely refined, and this was one of the most successful branches of Italian fascism. And among the various myths that were generated was, of course, the one of the famous 8 million bayonets that would have represented the Italian manpower that actually did not exist in this sense, but sort of reflects propagandistically what the regime had actually chosen as a broader military policy, because when this is not just on the fascists, but basically, like at this point, yes, in the previous decades after World War I, this was the thing. Italy had two options: either continuing with essentially a mass nation-state, almost 19th century style of army levy, or essentially investing on a more professional, contained, well-armored, well-advanced, combined arms, operation-focused military that, if pursued, by the way, would have not necessarily made Italy succeed during World War II, but surely would have placed her in a much better footing. The problem of Italy in general was that until the 1950s, it wouldn't be a fully industrialized country. At least there were lots of imbalances that technically as they still exist today. But of course, in a fashion that for the type of gain that World War II would become was, of course, rendering Italy particularly vulnerable. The point was also having this maritime accessible position, which had to contend against the strongest navies in the world. And Italy even had a good navy, telling the truth, but was still exposed to an ever more globalized world. And we'll see now what happened with the sanctions and the League of Nations. The idea was insisting on that sort of idea of manpower. The Italian soldier was the hero, World War I, dedicated to the fatherland, to the extreme sacrifice, and Mussolini was himself fairly confident about this too. I mean, the man had his own beliefs. He was also, it was actually a successful politician. I mean, he was. This is not a. Again, you should hate fascism. I mean, its capacity and its criminality, but nobody can't deny that Mussolini was the best politician within his generations, like in Italy, among the various other figures that sometimes were not even that bad, but objectively wouldn't be able to achieve this striking success that Il Duce did in leading, in fact, after all, what was, even if gradually, still a modernizing nation. Like Italians were starting to buy American cars. They wanted to leave that kind of bourgeois life. Like the majority of the people, of course, were poor, undereducated, and all this stuff. But there was that sort of backbone capable of, inspiring to much. This was actually a problem for fascism because, remember what I said before regarding this last couple of topics. If Mussolini was a socialist at heart, he couldn't like a bourgeois army or a bourgeois society, right? And this, in many ways, undermined the same Italian war effort. Mussolini's determination managed to establish him, however, as a respected figure in international politics. What I was saying at the beginning, what may seem today like the most astonishing thing, it was true. Like, Mussolini was very admired abroad. This is absolutely true among, again, the same Western allies that would have been fighting the Italian fascists in World War II. Italy in the 1930s was also a leading country, as we were saying before, for example, in aeronautic. Right? Italy had the most advanced air force in the world. It had accomplished really incredible feats like the transatlantic flyings to Southern America, all connected there for the Italian immigrants that normally were actually invited. The interesting thing there is that while in North America Italians were barely considered whites, actually in Southern America they were expressly invited to whiten the race, right? A matter of perspective. And in general, the same Italy's military power was looked upon with respect. As we said before, like the Royal Navy, the Italian Royal Navy, the Italian Royal Air Force were actually pretty good and really groundbreaking, especially in the 1930s. The army was so-so, but it wasn't even that bad as it's often pointed out. Like, the Italians failed so badly on land during World War II, not because they had bad cadres or just bad troops overall. Mostly they didn't have much firepower and armored forces because of the industrial shortcomings, right? They started producing actually pretty damn good stuff in 1943, but that the war was over for them, and so we didn't see that. And the problem was the actual political direction, like attacking France through the Alps or Greece through the same mountains. In that way, it's not that the Italian military was incapable of, or inept or whatever. They just were told to do something that had just to please, that Clausewitzianly, the political direction. And actually, the same cadres objected heavily to that. It is also how essentially same fascism eventually left the scene, as we pointed out before. Because, however, this international recognition, Mussolini was considered also a key player in, as you know, the very delicate, as we were recalling, European balance of power. Consider there is something called the Soviet Union. Point, right? So that doesn't justify fascism, but motivates it as hell. And as you know, there is also somebody north of the Alps that is starting to do something much more actually efficient than Italian fascism, albeit essentially taking inspiration, actually being a great admirer of the same, as we will see now. That is starting to threaten a bit like the entire continental order. And the measure of Mussolini's success internationally is exemplified by the fact that many politicians flocked to Palazzo Venezia, in Venice Square in Italy, where we have the same palace, the altar to the fatherland, etc. Which is called like this, by the way, because in the Ancien regime, this was the Venetian embassy in the Papal States, right, in Rome. And at this point, this place that was the same building that Mussolini made his proclaims from on the balcony, famously enough, in his sort of oceanic gatherings, would be attended by grand politicians. And there is an idea that there was almost like a homage to pay to Mussolini in order to come visit him in a way. That's the propaganda the regime sort of feed off from. This visits without restitution, as an Italian journalist once said, characterized by the obligatory recognition of Mussolini's great politics, right? A way, again, to self-aggrandize. And the same journalist, which was called Armando Ravaglioli, was Emilian but Roman by adoption, noted that correctly that the problems of the Mediterranean and the Balkans could not be ignored in light of Mussolini's attitude, which had staked all his real and fictitious cards on those chessboards. Also because, yes, a power like Italy could and would influence them heavily. In all this, we do not talk again about the actual conflict that existed with Germany. Mussolini, for example, was very friend with Dollfuss, the Austrian dictator, was taken out by the Nazis before the Anschluss. And Nazi Germany was, of course, aware that in order to be a world power, it needed a Mediterranean let out, right? And given that the Italians controlled that with their navy, that was the strongest in a concentrated fashion, because the French had a stronger one, but also one that had control, a broader chessboard. Well, there was a problem, right? Passing the Brenner, where also Mussolini sent his divisions at a point, was a war was about to break out in the 1930s between Italy and Germany. And the general importance that places like Romania would have, famously enough, for its oil fields, and generally speaking the Balkans, that Italy had its hegemonic claims on, and realistically speaking, right? This is not to be underestimated at all. And the same, consider that what had happened with Ataturk's regime, and how the French, the English, the Italians had control, the Greeks had controlled parts of Turkey. It was all a broader hegemonic idea that Italy had of the Mediterranean, also because, as you know, the heavily Roman-inspired propaganda that, in fact, the empire would have, like with the Roman ideal being the truly, in some ways, the traditional one that Mussolini probably wouldn't understand to the fullest, or at least would bend to that sort of national socialistic understanding, 20th century style. But that was truly one of, let's say, really continental hegemony. In essence, so when the politics of Palazzo Venezia were of great interest, because Mussolini was convinced that having achieved certain positions of prestige for Italy in the world would grant his country peace, right? That's also apparently like nonsensical if you consider that, of course, as we will see now, Italy wouldn't hesitate to intervene militarily speaking, but of course these interventions were all aimed at counterbalancing the situation and not really getting to World War II, and that type of war that was thought in a sense to be achievable, like to be winnable in a few time, right? It's the idea that if Britain had backed down in 1940, after all, it was done, and so this would have won a prestigious place to Italy as part of the Axis later on, and not getting to that much bigger fort that eventually was put up against the same Axis. And in fact, this is the point. This imperialistic enterprise was met with doubts about the Italian real military capabilities. Nonetheless, a certain pretentious attitude would have remained ineffective if it had not been accompanied by an assertion of strength that would attract the attention of international public opinion and garner some consensus even within. Right? This should be pointed out. Mussolini decided, first of all, to reopen the issue of relations with Ethiopia, that, as you know, had burningly defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa. Right? It's a battle often remembered for saying, "Oh, look, this is a case of a primitive, underdeveloped people managed to defeat the cocky European colonizer." The Ethiopians of Adwa were not really mere underdeveloped savages, right? They had sometimes better rifles provided by France, by Russia, to fight the same Italians. It was just like a bigger power than other, like, these weren't simply, sub-Saharan tribesmen remained in the Middle Ages. The same battle was actually closely fought, and as a heavy blow it was for the Italian colonial ambitions, and it was a general shame for the way it was the whole thing was conducted, but exactly because the Italians had actually good chances of winning that, is in fact to be considered a bit with more hindsight also for 1935, right? By the way, this considered that Italy had a very recent colonial history, and in many ways it had not really, the entire colonization had not really been planned out that well. Like, the Italians mostly started with the idea that they had to win their own place in the sun, as they used to say, and to simply show again that they also got it compared to the other Europeans, and mostly also because of their naval projectional capabilities, but really without thinking much the thing out, right? It's, again, as Clausewitzians, politics and strategy are two different things, right? They mutually interfere one another, but they're at two different levels. So one must understand what Italy did since the beginning, since the end of the 19th century, for better and for worse. Right? They weren't really so badly put in terms of actual capabilities, but they mostly targeted the wrong objectives in many ways. Like, the Horn of Africa was not that particularly appealable place. The Italians had successfully conquered Libya, for example, was full of oil, but that at the time, except some, enlightened Italian engineers that were like, they wouldn't have properly the vision to start investing into in order to find, etc., because otherwise Libya had practically nothing. Say Mussolini used in Ethiopia a border incident as a pretext, because the Italians control, as you know, other parts like Eritrea, Somalia, etc. And so they had to remain in pretty hostile relations with Ethiopia in the first place. And they launched the war against the country on October the 2nd, 1935. The Italian troops advanced on the Eritrean front under the command of Marshal Badoglio, and on the Somali front under the command of General Graziani. These names are quite famous both in World War I and World War II. Right? They were there at Caporetto under Cadorna. They would be later, like during World War II. There are interesting, say, anecdotes about like the entire evaluation of their command, etc. But generally speaking, the War of Ethiopia was competently run. Right? There's no doubt about this. The Italian military campaign would procure, however, Italy lots of problems internationally, right? Because the League of Nations that had been established, as you know, after World War I, deemed this war like a genuine aggression against a peaceful state and imposed economic sanctions on Italy, urging member states to refrain from supplying the country with war-related products. By the way, this is the point at which Italy self-expels her from the League of Nations. Right, so it's not that they kicked her out. The fascists decided to desert it. And this creates, of course, further attrition because of the delegitimization of this international institution that should have essentially preserved an order, especially like after, like in the Wilsonian direction after World War I, that it was a failure, objectively, and at this point Italy was part of those who sabotaged this and, say, paving the way also to World War II. Now, the Italian position, again on the sea, with lots of ports, etc., made the sanctions pretty failed, right? Because of what the country traded with mostly like the main international powers like France, Britain, etc., that controlled the seas, and the main commerce, like they had great industrial push and so on. And Italy's existing reserves of gold and raw materials had to be depleted in order to cope with this. This caused significant concern among Italians. Italy had actually carried out, because of Mussolini's populistic and Roman-inspired, say, policies, a system of autarky that basically consisted mostly in fact, in view of this possible attritions with abroad, like the idea of an autonomy, right, from the international market, which was substantiated especially in the boosting of Italy's agricultural resources. This was actually, like, because of the heterogenesis of the ends, proved one of the greatest success of fascism. There were actually very few. A couple of them, this may have been actually the only one in hindsight. That is that when the 1929 crisis struck, Italy was much better prepared, basically, than any other country at the time for like the problems of grain, the rise in grain cost. Like Britain had to, for example, unload all the burden of countries like Canada, etc. Like Italy in this much had produced enough grain to be out there, self-sufficient. However, you don't live only of bread, right? And so, of course, there was a lot of, creativity that the Italians had to display in order to actually keep on living without so many precious materials that were necessary just in everyday life. This came to affect even fashion, etc. There is probably a phase of Italian history was marked by these sanctions. There was, during the war, this effort also symbolized by acts of love to the fatherland, led by the same royals. For example, Queen Elena of Montenegro was the wife of Victor Emmanuel III, made an appeal from the altar of the fatherland for the offering of her wedding ring, which was generously accepted in Rome and throughout Italy. This day became known as the Day of Faith, right? The Day of the Wedding Ring, basically, and was celebrated on December the 18th, 1935. It was a fascist festival with an extraordinary success across Italy, right? The event was also blessed by the church that, as you know, had essentially negotiated with the fascist regime particular conditions regarding essentially the reintegration of many aspects of papal policy in Italian Catholicism after the very cold relations that had historically followed with the Italian state that historically followed the conquest of Rome by the Italian army in 1870, and that under fascism had said warming up a bit again. And the collection of the wedding rings that were essentially exchanged for some iron ones, also meaningfully for this more increasingly militarized mentality, yielded over 500 million lire to the Italian state. This was a lot, right? Essentially, the Italians, as it often happens with dictators, were actually supporting the regime, right? One can say that, yes, there was a general sense of ignorance or feeling of powerlessness, or, they didn't know what they were doing, but we must be really honest. Like, if you are in a country that is run by a regime, you're accomplice to that regime, unless you're in jail, or in exile, or underground, right? And in the grave. There is no other excuse. And of course, every government can govern exclusively because of the decisive moral support of its population. And the Italians were supporting fascism. And they were fascist. They were a fascist people. There's no way around that. Just like the Germans were Nazis, it's complete and utter BS to say that. No, but they didn't. They were just obliged. BS. Everyone. Soviets were supporting the Soviet regime in the most ridiculous ways, right? The Soviets were literally and hysterically and paranoidly terrorized by the regime. They didn't understand absolutely anything about what was going on, but like sheep, they were simply obeying, right? Because they were simply, and this characteristic of that, people completely terrorized. This is history. This is basic history. Like, it shouldn't even be pointed out, but this is it, right? And Italians were fascists during World War II. There's no other way around that. And this war effort was in fact perceived as a plebiscite in support of Mussolini's actions and Italy's participation in the Ethiopian War. The war, by the way, proceeded rapidly, with the Ethiopian forces led by the Negus Haile Selassie valiantly defending their territory, but after 7 months of military campaigning, the Italian troops entering Addis Ababa, this was like the point. Like, in this case, like after again 40 years of Western development, the Italians really made like a massacre. I think they killed as many as 700,000 Abyssinians. They used gas, they used armored forces, they literally made a freaking extermination, and they were successful, military speaking. There is no doubt about this. It is true that Ethiopia is huge. The territory is also pretty wild in the hinterland, and it is true that until throughout the World War II and the end of it, with the Italian defeat, the Italians would remain for some years after, like, they were granted by the Allies, like to run the government in some parts of the Horn of Africa after that. But I mean, there had been guerrilla. Even if the country had been conquered by the Italians, it would go on, right? And that would take some toll, right? But the main problem about this wasn't that, really. That was relatively unimportant. The thing was, rather, what did the Italians get from Ethiopia? Because it's not really, a particularly rich country in resources, right? On May the 9th, 1936, Mussolini announced from the balcony of Palazzo Venezia that the war had ended in the Italian victory, and proclaimed the establishment of an empire, as we were saying, with Victor Emmanuel III as Emperor of Ethiopia, in addition to his title as King of Italy. The returning soldiers, by the way, had exhibited remarkable heroism throughout the campaign. This is often overlooked about, say, the Italian performance in this war. Like, the fact that you win or lose has nothing to do with courage. We've seen it in von Clausewitz. Courage is important. Von Clausewitz is quite praising that in a noble sense, but he explains that it's not just, that courage is actually in proportion to what you need in war, one of the cheapest qualities, right? And lesser people think that it just takes to be courageous and to win wars. It has nothing to do with that, right? But unfortunately, since lesser people believe this, they also believe that if a country loses, it's because its people are cowards. And so, again, the Italians are cowards during World War II because they lost. No, right? I honestly never read an account of Italian military performance that was saying, this troops, like, even during World War II, during the worst defeats of Italy, during that war, said those cowards, they acted, they underperformed with what they had, or they were actually, and this is strikingly constant, like, very motivated, and even well performing given the few that they actually had. This is true for officers, troops, NCOs. Like, it's a thing in military historical terms, and so you can have that even with disastrous outcomes. There is no doubt. That's a problem of hierarchy, but mostly of political guidance. And if Italy failed so badly during World War II, it's because fascism failed politically. There's no doubt about this either. And so there is this, speaking of the city of Rome, for example, the Italians brought from Ethiopia the famous Lion of Judah. That was the symbol of the Ethiopian Empire. And this was done together with obelisks, for example, eventually, also after World War II, Italy in part gave back to Ethiopia. But it was a thing, of course, mirroring what the Romans used to do when they conquered other places. And the Lion of Judah, and there are pictures, I inserted also a colorized one here, was placed at the foot of the Dogali obelisk in memory of the 500 heroes. And this is a square in Rome that essentially referred to the fight of the square of the 500. In fact, it were these, I think, 448 Italian soldiers that had been massacred by more than 7,000 Abyssinians during the first war against Ethiopia. In fact, in Dogali in 1887. And at the time, this massacre of national troops had deeply impressed the Italians that had established this obelisk in memory of the fallen, that were tributed here, like with the memory of this later generations of victors over the Ethiopians, the same symbol of the defeated country. So, with the conquest of Ethiopia, Mussolini achieved significant popularity. Yet, as we were saying, the cost of the endeavor was extremely high. The practical benefits were relatively limited. I don't know, maybe Italians paid coffee a bit less, after conquering Ethiopia, but there was this point. Ethiopian resources were not as abundant as, first of all, fascist propaganda had claimed to convince the Italians to fight for it. Then the country's exploitation of those resources that Ethiopia had would require money that, especially in this situation with the sanctions and all, Italy did not have, and that would have also been like, I don't know, better to invest maybe in the same Italy, in some more close and important endeavors. Nevertheless, the fascist government embarked on another military campaign, the one of the Spanish Civil War, that, as you know, was a sort of pre-World War II in Europe as far as the brutality and especially the ideology that was at stake there, because it was essentially a fascist government fighting against socialists but not communists. The Nazis were involved, the Italians were involved, the Soviets were involved. There were actually volunteers a bit from everywhere, as you know, as there had been in China against the Japanese, etc. This war began in July the 18th, 1936, with a coup. Now, we don't digress on the details of the Spanish Civil War. We may make a video about that, actually, because it's an important thing, also, again, especially in pre-World War II Egypt, but not only, like the complicacy of, say, of the campaign of the war was is really interesting also from a strategical point of view, and aside from the political movers. Italy provided aid to the Spanish reactionaries who shared similar ideological views with fascism. And the Civil War would last until 1939. Yet not another year devoid of greater meaning. Italy's involvement in Spain further depleted her already scarce resources and contributed to a deterioration in her relations with democratic powers, who at this point realized that the Italians were ever more tied to the Axis that had been signed in Berlin on October the 24th, the Rome-Berlin Axis Agreement between Italy and Germany, that we know as the Axis, and this entailed like some broader cooperation and probably now an Italian side choosing after, as we've seen, the initial enmity with Germany. And so a consolidating axis within the same Europe among like this mounting rearming Germany as with their hegemonic continental hegemonic ambitions, and the Italian naval power and axis of Mediterranean could threaten like the major routes like to the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic from Europe, and so quite a relevant one. Now, as living standards became increasingly expensive in Italy due to the sanctions, a popular rhyme condemned the war with 4 significant verses. And here there is a bit of Roman Goliardy that we have to add, because at the end of the day we're talking here about Rome. And it sounds something like, translated, without an empire and without Spain, we ate sponge cake. With Spain and with the empire, we eat black bread, meaning that, after all, this, say, international adventures had not really brought Italy that advantage that her population hoped it would. And this is, in fact, a very important turning point in Italian history during under fascism, because up to these years, Italians had, as we were saying before, supported fascism, and they would support in it for some year, until 1943, where also the Allies like forced them, of course, to change ideas. But it's also the moment in which properly the Italian consensus towards fascism starts going down. Right. Up to that point, things had been fixed. The communist revolts had been repressed initially. There had been a political stabilization. Doesn't matter if this had been brutal and killing political adversaries. Italy had stabilized. There had been all these efforts, as we've seen. The grain battle, as they called it, had actually helped Italy coming out better than anyone except Britain from the 1929 crisis. There was all a revitalized pride towards the Italian culture, its national unification. There were actually, as we were saying in the beginning, lots of great talents, scientists, artists that worked and lived in Italy. In fascist times, Italy had greatly contributed to many fields, right, worldwide, major discoveries and inventions. This is no propaganda, it's real. Actually, fascism probably didn't propagandize that as much as it would, because there was also this ambiguity for which they had sort of obliged basically all the Italian professors to essentially swear loyalty to the regime and all this kind of things. We'll see now how some left, especially after the issuing of the racial laws, which the most hateful of the fascist policies. That's also a very interesting topic, by the way, because up to that point, we'll see it now, like fascists had been actually pretty careless about race, without mentioning that, first of all, in Italy there were few Jews compared to Germany, Poland, where historically were much larger amount. Also, like if you look at the Jewish somatic stereotype, it's not that Italians look particularly different. Like, they had to characterize, I don't know, big noses, or to discriminate against the Jews, etc. Like that's Family Guy made some jokes about that as well. And in any case, when you look at European Jews, especially affecting this smaller community, but also very old communities, like Rome had the oldest European Jewish community, at least in Western Europe. They had significantly blended. I mean, couldn't really tell from a racial point of view who was in other countries, or some who was in Northern Europe, blonde, blue-eyed Jews, and without any. They were actually much whiter than many other connationals, right? Now, despite these early signs, this early cracking, right, Italy's involvement in the Spanish conflict continued to escalate. It's interesting to look at the means, because it also shows actually that Italy, at that point, had considerable military resources. By January 1937, a General Mario Ratta's expeditionary force consisted of over 35,000 soldiers, which would eventually swell up to 60,000 troops, along with 800 planes, 8,000 vehicles, and 90 ships. Consider that. It's not that the Italians weren't properly holding the front of the war, but they did contribute dramatically to the fascist victory eventually. And these are all very expensive means. Especially like if you look at the beginning of World War II, that no country was even remotely prepared to do it, right? Also, especially from an industrial point of view. I mean, not even the German initial successes were due to any particular quality or order. Like the Germans were just the best. In many ways, they were the only ones who could carry out things like Operation Barbarossa, but it's not before 1942 that, say, countries get shaped in a way that they can fully sustain the war in a sort of more positively orderly fashion, right? And by that point, basically, they already lost on the Axis side. So by the end of the Spanish Civil War, there were 11,000 Italian fascist casualties, of which 4,000 KIAs, plus, as if these dreadful times had influenced the same civilian world, there were very famous and important Italians who died at home, such as Ettore Petrolini, Luigi Pirandello in 1936, Guglielmo Marconi in 1937, so those big names. Also, some Italians fled, especially with the racial laws. Enrico Fermi, that, as you know, would contribute as a project director of the Manhattan project, one of the greatest physicists of the time, Nobel laureate, who had married a Jewess, fled to the United States in 1938, where in fact would contribute to the bomb creation. And Rome's reputation as a regime under imperial guise was tarnished, despite efforts to present a strong image through grandiose gatherings in Piazza Venezia, completion of urban planning projects, and the institution also of the so-called Roman Pass, which is often not remembered, but this was essentially an imitation of Germany's goose step. Like, it was just a failed attempt in some ways to actually, affirm itself. It was, however, first introduced during a military parade at the Colosseum in January 1931. On May the 3rd of the same year, you have Hitler's visit to Rome. This was definitely a testament to the imperial aura surrounding him. I mean, we often talk about tradition, and on this channel, of course, in times where this was much more alive than anything the Nazi fascists had tried to revive in their, say, mass world and heavily modernized, secularized context. But imagine this, and this is important for our videos also on the Holy Roman Empire and the idea of the empire and the papacy. And so the idea of a revived German Reich, for example, allied with an Italian Roman fascist regime. Hitler in Rome, in the city par excellence, the urbs of the Caesars, and of course displaying this Axis friendship with all kind of traditional meanings, eagles mostly everywhere. Of course, the swastikas, the solar symbols, the fasces of the Roman tradition. So there was a series of military parades and popular demonstrations serving to emphasize the strong affinity between the Nazi and fascist regimes, which, as you know, we were pointing out before, were actually never like the full thing. That the notion, again, is that always Italy was the one who betrayed somebody else. When you look at Savoy history, that's called instinct of survival. It's not much like actually something that many other countries did, but especially about World War II, that is the one in which the concept is more often brought up. Like, you should really reconsider this in looking at what the Germans said and acted towards the Italians, probably even in hiding their actual plans as allies. In an alliance, it should have been but I'm not talking plans in the sense of we don't have to let the Italians know what we want to do because they're going to tell other people. They're literally acting out of their own volition just because they were thinking that this ally was not really a real ally, right? That they didn't care about them. There was also a lot of sort of racial tension indeed. Like, Italians were considered white, but say, generally speaking, like the Aryan prototype is not, of course, very much in comparison to a German associated with it. And in this broader competition between nations, I remember that Italy had fought against the Germans in World War I. Not just the Austro-Hungarians, but Caporetto had succeeded because of the German divisions that had been sent on purpose. This created some embarrassment, by the way, when Rommel met with his Italian peers and, displayed one medal that he won at the Matajur, by the way. So this is one of those kind of strange paths that war takes, but that are interesting to intertwine, like in the broader tapestry of history, if you want. And on the occasion of Hitler's visit to Rome, Mussolini had gone to Germany already, etc. There was an undercurrent of coldness actually palpable between the guest and especially King Victor Emmanuel III, also his daughter-in-law. There was a general understanding, of course, that the alliance with the Nazis was not much of a convinced one. You see, the Nazis, as we were saying before, making the comparison also with the Italian fascists, had truly, like Hitler controlled Germany. The SS controlled literally everything, right? There was not such a thing like another government, something else. In Italy, you had Mussolini that did things as the head of the government, but the head of the state was the king. And in many ways, Mussolini did not have really a full control on the system. So in a military positive way, he could, of course, he had already knocked out basically his political opponents, the enemy, say the opposite parties, etc. But so the fascist party reigned supreme. But it was just like a concurrence of the whole Italian system, also in an institutional sense, not just as the moral support of the people. There was somebody else controlling Italy, right next to Mussolini. This was not the case in Nazism. And so when you look at the actual rigidity and brutality and sort of coldness of the Nazi regime, I realized that also these allies were somehow uncomfortable to host Hitler. Let's say they maintain, especially the monarchy, but not only, this sense of mostly, say, modern constitutional, this case, kingdoms, like with an internal balance, kind of a traditional history of also political debate in spite of this totalitarian regime that had allowed to happen, but still allowing it, right? Hitler's Germany was a completely different thing in that sense, and this was sort of embarrassing also in international sense, also because who was Hitler, right? You could say, who was Mussolini? Well, he wasn't the head of Italy, if not in a political, say, a moral sense, but Italy was a monarchy. There was a king, and was there a tradition, a history. It was not the fascist one, right? Not even Mussolini was technically a fascist at heart, as we've seen. If you know the story, like he basically won the fascists as his bands that had been institutionalized, but again, not in that sense of pervasively SS style fashion. And he had been ruling just out of, with his previous ideas in many ways. By the way, the staging that Mussolini prepared for Hitler was opulent. The Aventino Alley was brightly illuminated. Large Roman and Germanic eagles were installed in the Impero Road that had been renamed, of course, because of this. As you know, we will see this better for the history of Rome. Mussolini carried out a great deal of urbanistic changes. He raised also some historical structures, buildings. In some ways, the damage is, of course, irreparable. It's not actually so immense as it's sometimes said, but say there was a part of Rome. Part of Rome that was actually built also outside, but in the very center of the city there were some areas, such as the Spina di Borgo, for example, that was raised. There was the some even in front of the Colosseum, the Meta Sudans, was destroyed, which was, really a pity. The Imperial Fora Roads, but that was made by Mussolini, of course, because there wasn't that open way, and again, it maybe makes sense if you look at what was done, I don't know, in Paris, like if you compared, especially as a medievalist, to the modern, to the medieval city, like, oh my god, it's terrifying. But in fact, it's always painful to see something old go that way anyway. In any case, these were the occasions on which, in fact, these urbanistic readaptations would turn out useful. All the streets traversed by the procession were adorned with a series of ephemeral constructions that cost approximately 1 billion lire, which were also kind of ridiculous, and just to show Rome internationally in video, etc., like as something bigger, ever more monumental than it was. Actually, again, in this, the fascist propaganda was great. They achieved the unthinkable in so many ways, especially in visual arts. They really rocked hard. But of course, this was a great waste in the first place, and there is a Pasquinade. Pasquinus is a statue in the center of Rome that dates to Roman times, that the Romans traditionally, I think this still happens actually, they fix some papers under to express the voice of the people. And so it's as if Pasquinus himself spoke this. And so this popular voice mocked Hitler, of course, ridiculing the lavish decorations as well as the Führer's early background. And there was this phrase who sounded something like, "My poor Rome of travertine, they have redecorated you entirely with cardboard, for it will be admired by a house painter," like Hitler had actually been. And so this is actually a pretty painful, bitter, beautiful phrase, by the way. If you think about Roman past, just sort of insulted by such a thing. So as we were saying before, there was concurrently a racist ideology gaining traction. On July the 14th, 1938, an unsigned, interestingly, manifesto of racist scientists, so-called, was published in the Italian newspaper Giornale d'Italia. The list of authors comprised pathologists, psychiatrists, anthropologists. It was subsequently published 11 days later following their submission to the Minister of Popular Culture, Dino Alfieri, and the Secretary of the National Fascist Party, the PNF, Achille Starace, who had formally approved the document. But this is interesting because Italy had been also at the forefront of this kind of Darwinistic, phrenological, sort of racistic ideas. There was, for example, Wilfredo Pareto. These were famous names in the international, say, community, scientific community of the time. And we tend to forget that Europe coming out probably the heat of colonial times, these broader changes in the world, the necessity by these regimes to implement ever more fundamentalistic nationalist ideologies, was really convinced of the racial superiority and inferiority of people. It was essentially the norm. Like, there were some scientists that were saying, no, it was not the case. I'd say that Nazi fascism and other ideologies were tending, in the sense, to spread this message in the masses that had nothing to do with the traditional transcendence of humanity, that would have thus, in the presence of divinity, being able to transcend the same phenotype, like the same human form. So they were actually propagating some sort of zoological materialism that had hardly to do with the traditional racial theory as it existed, like in the millennia, right? So that's the point of nation states, of national socialism and nationalism and socialism. I'm talking communism as well. It was a ferocious anti-Semitism in communist countries as well. So you don't have to. This is the point, to be that at ease by thinking, but we fought against these guys. Well, in the U.S. and in Sweden, there were eugenetic policies, right? So it's most people were normally racist and were normally adverse against, like the head of the Royal Navy before World War II, speaking of Italy, said we must reaffirm our rule on a racially inferior people, right? And except that they had thought to knock out the Italian Navy out of the war in the first year. That never happened. There was in general like a great sense of aggressiveness and ferocity in that competition. That's why I was saying also about the issues between Italians and Germans that we're all aware of in this context. There is no doubt that we don't talk now specifically about the racial laws in Italy, but these were made by Mussolini just to please Hitler. It's that obvious, because actually fascism had gone in the opposite direction, right? And there were historical songs of fascism, such as Faccetta Nera, for example. The tune is beautiful, by the way. There's also the Italian Social Republic version in the later time, adapted to the last years of the war, that was banned by the same fascist regime. Why? Because this was a song which means black little face, that essentially was referring to the Italian colonial adventure and speaking to this Abyssinian woman who was told that she would have been made Italian and Roman by the fascist conquest, which was actually sort of a racially mixing proposition of some sort, because the idea was initially in fascism that everybody had to become a Roman, a bit like the sense that there was here read in a fourth estate, actually anti-traditional sense, that everybody had to be extended Roman citizenship. It has nothing to do with what actually happened in Rome. Concretely, we made multiple videos about this. And therefore, when the racial laws were issued by the same Italian government, this song was banned because it was actually pro mixed race to some extent. And these laws were not issued much in function of the peoples conquered by the Italians, but towards the Jews, right? So the Italian Jews, and again, perfectly integrated and historically also patriotic community in Italy that, again, was pretty narrow. Like, if you want to look at the criminal, Nazi purposes, also in stealing goods from actually a very large mass of people in Germany and Poland to fund the war effort and more, using cheap labor forces that are in Italy was useless, right? The Jews were not even to be really spotted in ethnic terms, and so there was objectively a stain on Italian culture at so many levels. The consequences were bizarre also in so many ways, aside from the fact we've seen also among the Freikorps that basically the German High Command wanted to scapegoat the Jews, because of the failure of the war. Instead, they carried out the survey, and it turned out that the Jews were fighting disproportionately larger numbers in the front lines. They had to eliminate this document. They had to keep things silent about that. But in Italy, there wasn't even the same of course, the level of racial hatred and historical anti-Semitism that exists in Germany. Again, in countries like Italy, the Netherlands, Jews had been treated in a completely, had been the product of a completely different cultural history. Central Europe, Germany, again, Poland, etc., also Eastern Europe, completely different history. And so there wasn't even, anti-Judaism wasn't invented by the Nazis. It sadly existed since a very long time, almost a millennium. And the Italians did not essentially carry out those massacres that in Germany were actually carried out since the very beginning of Nazi regime. Like, they didn't have to await the final solutions. This is notorious. It's extremely well documented. They started massacring Jews immediately, right? The Italians did not do this, right? The Italians began to discriminate against the Jews. There was actually, yes, also some anti-Semitic verve in Italy. This is not to say that that was a no, unfortunately, but it did not translate. It said they shut down businesses. They actually prevented Jews from going to school, these kind of things, but they wouldn't exterminate. The thing was very evident, by the way. I mean, people noticed that this was a thing. However, it's not until 1943, so when the Nazis basically take over Italy, when the Italians surrendered and their armed forces were paralyzed, and most of these guys were essentially deported to labor camps, and 600,000 people to Germany and other places, that the Germans start picking Italian Jews and exterminating them, right? And this was like that wild. And it should be admitted that the Germans were an incredible, say, moral resources for the Italians, like to sort of saying, but we didn't do as bad as the Nazis did. Yeah, okay, but you were into it, and you perfectly know that as well, which is true basically for every people that allowed the Nazis to do this in the first place. In any case, on July the 28th, Pius Borgoncini Duca, there was a governmental official, reaffirmed the administration's commitment to addressing a racial issue in what was defined as a cultural effort to reclaim the country for Italians, which again was ridiculous because the Italians the Jews were a narrow minority in Israel. Like, they didn't have anything to do with all the Jewish question demographically in Central Europe. It was ridiculous, right? And the specific focus was on anti-Semitism. Not only this was also about the other, non-whites in general. Now, in addition, a growing sense of impending conflict was palpable. As we've seen, we have arrived to 1939. And things were getting heated, right? And also, like, it was, this is yet another very important story, like all our relation with the Vatican, which most people say, oh my God, the Pope, because of course it's the Black Legion. People decided that, Catholic priests molest more than, what happens in Protestant communities, that popes are perverts, that the Catholic word is bad. So this goes all in parallel with all the prejudices on, generally speaking, in Southern Europe, the Black Legion. It's just a part of the world that does that. And the idea is that the Pope helped the Nazis, even though actually the Nazis were at the top elite level, of course, ferociously anti-Christian. And except they couldn't be open about that because Germany was a Christian country. And there were all the Nazis essentially saw Christianity as a Jewish product, and so the meek that had made people sheep, and that had, the Nazis proposed, of course, to reactivate the more brutal genocidal instincts, to reawaken that sort of way of the left hand, the necessary to transcend into holy combat, etc. Except they lost the memo of, if you are superior in everything, everybody immediately transforms on the basis of your power, which of course was ignoring from the Nazi side all the transcendence. and or at least the means of attaining this. This is another thing. However, on February the 10th, 1931, Pope Pius XI issued a statement condemning the violation of the Lateran Pacts, the Lateran Accords, by the Italian government, as well as the racial persecutions perpetrated by the German authorities, as well as Germany's preparations for war, which is not exactly like support towards the Nazis. Pius XI was succeeded this very weeks actually by the Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, who took the papal name of Pius XII, famously enough. So the guy that would actually go through World War II. And on March the 3rd, the day following his election, Pius II delivered a radio message to the global community imploring nations to pursue peace. Remember how the papacy had invited this, like the senseless bloodshed to end in World War I, in their words. However, needless to say, Germany was quite infatuated with, of course, her own newly imperial ambitions, disregarded the papal plea, and occupied Czechoslovakia. We are in March, right? While Italy was celebrating General Francisco Franco's victory in Spain, with military parades held in Rome for the occasion. Moreover, on April the 1st, 1939, Pius II personally dispatched a telegram to General Franco, in this sense extending his blessings. It was also partially done because of what was at stake there. Of course, like the socialist counterpart that had many ways, like the church involvement in the two sides was, of course, not towards the left one, but this was just a general, recognition between heads of state, right? Not much that, pro-fascist attitude, right? It was a waving, crazy, just having a dialogue with the leader. Now, on April 7th, it was Good Friday, the Italian Air Force launched a bombing campaign against Tirana, and Albania was subsequently as swiftly occupied by Italian forces. This was the Italian conquest of the country. A gathering of local notables and dignitaries subsequently presented the crown of Albania to King Victor Emmanuel III. By the way, Albania was not like a threatening or just a hostile country, right? In theory, not even Greece was in a broader sense. But Italy had to show Germany that they could work, right? And so at this point, they simply occupied the first Balkan country, all right, with that Italian sense of we must take over that part of Europe. But this was sort of obvious, was broadly accepted by the Nazis as well. Meanwhile, Pope Pius XII delivered an Eastern Day address to the faithful, urging them to strive for peace and reconciliation. Still, he refrained from making any direct reference to the violent events that had transpired on Good Friday. On May the 22nd, the so-called Pact of Steel was signed in Berlin. This was a reinforcement of the Axis, marking a formal alliance between Italy and Germany in a truly military sense. Also, there's a very interesting chapter in here about what Italy and Germany were sort of planning their resources to be organized by. The Italians demanded an enormity of resources, and the Germans took them seriously and began to send it to them, right, for activating an industry that, again, was sort of more asphyctic than the German one. But let's also remember that without the French and Italian industries, the Nazis could have not invaded the Soviet Union. So actually, this was a quite relevant aspect of a broader policy that the Nazis had to take care of as far as providing and getting Italian labor force to support the German war effort as well, the Axis one now. And the Pact of Steel committed the two nations to, of course, automatically come to each other's aid in the event of a war involving also one of their allies. Just one day later, on May the 23rd, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also known as the literal Nazi-Soviet Pact. That's an aspect that we sort of enormously underestimate, because yes, they agreed to divide Poland between them, and of course those Soviet pigs were essentially to actually let the Nazis finish Poland off and then stepping in. But the aspects that we tend to overlook is not just that the Soviets were scared like hell of being invaded by the Nazis, even though their actual forces deployment was offensive, was in an offensive function till the last, which also dramatically facilitated Barbarossa a couple of years later. But that the Soviets actively financed Germany in its European war with an enormous amount of money. By the way, the Nazis used to eventually to invade the same Soviet Union. And we'll have to make a video about this, because it's, say, aside from, yes, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, we know what it was. Like, remember, Nazis and Soviets were friends. Even if just, of course, by temporary convenience, but they actually supported each other very thoroughly. So we're again 2 years away from Barbarossa, and this would have still to unfold the way we know. The Nazis could fail. They could actually fail in Poland, which is also a very overlooked aspect, as much as they could fail in France, even more likely. And in general, the history of the world could have gone in a strikingly different way, exactly also on the basis of the Soviet-Nazi relation there. So in response to these developments, and also considering the heavily Catholic national identity of Poland, Pope Pius XII broadcast a message from Castel Gandolfo, the Roman castles in the volcanic lake next to Rome, on August the 24th, issuing a stark warning to the world that sounded like, nothing is lost with peace. Anything can happen with war. Right, and that's a hell of a heaven of a statement. By the way, Castel Gandolfo, as you know, I inserted some pictures. It's still the papal residence, famously not the summer one, as there are all these vestiges of papal, say, tradition in Rome that survive, aside from the lost, not independence, but say the radical reduction of what was papal power before on the city. Now, on September the 2nd, the Italian Council of Ministers issued a statement announcing that the country would not take any military initiatives. However, this declaration was merely a bluff, as it was a ruse intended to buy time. In reality, letters and meetings took place between Mussolini and Hitler at the Brenner Pass between the two countries, because Austria was part of Germany, which is something that I like to tell in general as a medievalist, like 100 times. But yes, Austria is German. It's just like another Deutsch country, which revealed that Italy would ultimately join Germany's side. So it was just like making the population a bit easy about this, like, don't worry, we're not going to do anything. But of course, the Italians were tying with all themselves to the German war fort, because of what we were saying in the beginning, what Mussolini really wanted for Italy, like a quick war against France and Britain, and the United States, by the way, which would leave like Germany and Italy dividing Europe, sharing Europe among themselves, concentrating on the Soviet threat and sort of affirming like an unprecedented power that would bring fortune to Italy. And again, as a military historian, I would like to make the entire history of these episodes, but we have to go speedily here. Like the offensive, as you know, the Western Front with France commenced on May the 10th, 1940. In response, France, Britain, and the United States sent urgent messages to Mussolini, urging him not to intervene in the war. Think about it. I mean, we tend to, unfortunately, say more recent times have rehabituated us to this sort of diplomatic, like information, say, don't do this, don't do that, warnings, whatever. But think about it at the time. We're talking World War II, right? Our grandparents were there, and it's very relevant. And needless to say, the Allies' entreaties to Italy fell on deaf ears. On May the 29th, a meeting of high-ranking military leaders held at Palazzo Venezia, where from Benito Mussolini publicly declared his intention to actively intervene on behalf of Germany, and subsequently requested that King Victor Emmanuel III grant him supreme command of the Italian armed forces. Right, consider that at this point Mussolini had made his choice. Some people say that he had been battled, as we've seen in the previous years also, regarding which side to take, and that he chose the German one, not the Allied one, because he knew German better than English. And this is not far from the truth, likely. There was a lot, again, that Churchill was trying, as we said, that he would keep on trying during the war. Of course, when Italy had already been in the war against the Saint Britain, to bring the Italians from the Allied side, because obviously, that would have made things much easier. Then they went, for that matter, and that's when we tend to underestimate actually how relevant Italy was in all this game. So many people died because of this. This is incredibly relevant, and this is due to Italian resistance and the capacity to resist. And even after they decided to bail out of the war, like still paying for this by being occupied by the Germans and actually seeing half of their country destroyed. Now, there were people close to Mussolini and generally speaking aware of the situation that were doubting till the end that Italy would enter the war, because there was a general understanding that it would have not been that easy as it seemed, right? But here, Mussolini really rushed in. It was a sort of, fiery, sort of, cocky and arrogant man. The king was reluctant to relinquish his authority over to the military, to Mussolini, and instead opted to engage in negotiations with him to reach a compromise, right? Because it was a matter of, like, this guy actually is running the Italian government after all, and of course the king had the higher military authority, and this had to be negotiated. And after these negotiations, King Victor Emmanuel III agreed to grant Mussolini command of the Italian troops participating in the war, albeit with some conditions, of course, or limitations that were not specified in the text. So, of course, the king was not surrendering his institutionally higher authority on the Italian armed forces, but he was implying that say Mussolini was left some operational authority, and like providing as the head of the government for all the necessary aspects that came with the needs of war and command. And so that's how we arrived to the beginning of World War II for Italy on June the 10th, 1940, when from the balcony of Piazza Venezia Mussolini declared, "An hour marked by destiny is striking in the sky of our homeland. The time for irreversible decisions has arrived. The declaration of war has already been handed over to the ambassadors of Great Britain and France." And this is pretty much how things went downhill. Just they started, like, of course, going further downhill from here, but that I presume that they're often not so, say, appreciated in their historical value and in their general sense of effective weight, of importance, of sense of our history past in a collective sense. I'm always struck by how people see history in an almost detached way, like saying, this is something that happens elsewhere, or it's maybe it's this country, it's not so important, or I don't care, or why should I? How can you know really history in general without getting interested in these things? There are so many, of course, that must be studied in general, and I know that the exotic topics are always quite welcome, but when you get a bit closer to like these major events that you've felt to know, because after all we've all heard of them, but like when we look at them in a bit more of a concrete way, like the question is why, why did this happen? Like, how did this happen? How was it even possible? How do we give for granted that, again, a major Western country would go at war? Because, of course, as we've seen, there had been specific decisions, there had been specific sightings already, but things could go so differently, and the complexity of politics and war is of this magnitudinal scale also as far as the variables are concerned. One must appreciate this is not randomness, this is deliberate choice, and that's what perhaps sort of deviates people from it, because it's difficult. You don't simply understand it. You don't simply say, oh, okay, I figure it out after all without too much of a problem. This stuff must be followed very carefully, must be sort of thought out, and not just in terms of simple events, but also understanding why did these events even happen in the first place. Do we give for granted that Italy would have fought, for example, on Germany's side at this point? That's not to be given for granted. And as you understand how much could change really from this, and how much the thing changed because things happened the way they did, so we know there is no spoiler. Still they're worth appreciating, because if we exist, technically it's because of this stuff. Like your chance of being born 1 second first, second later, right? Your conception actually depends on literally everything everybody does ever. And when you look at these events, well, just know that these are the things that made you. And so you may want to care about them, want to care about history. Very well. I was very, very, very glad to talk about this topic, because again, it showed we can talk contemporary history, right? And that there is always a lot to to learn from it. Just quantitatively speaking, obviously never ends much more than other eras, for which that is still true, of course. In any case, we coupled this with our interest for Rome. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.